FreeSync, 4K, and HDR. Well, sort of. Howdy guys, Ponchato here, and today we're going to take a look at the EL2870U from BenQ. Thanks to BenQ for sending this over, and let's get started. This is a 4K monitor, so the full proper 3840 by 2160 resolution. The diagonal size is 28 inches, so it actually has a pretty high pixel density, but not so high that it's unusable without scaling. In terms of design and build quality, this is a pretty standard monitor. It's matte black around the bezels, which is nice to prevent glare. The bezels are 17mm wide on the top and sides, and 22mm wide on the bottom. That'll get in the way for multi-monitor setups, but 4K is enough screen real estate that most people really won't need multiple displays. The base is plastic with a brushed metal look, and the stand is glossy black, which makes it a fingerprint magnet. Fortunately, it's set pretty far back, so you won't have to worry about accidentally smudging it. It also has some of the better OSD buttons of any monitor I've used. You don't have to hope the stand will keep the monitor in place when you push a button, because there's a ledge to grab onto whenever you're pressing them. That said, with no indicator lights or other way to tell which button you're actually pressing, it can be kinda hard to use in the dark. At the end of the OSD buttons is the power button. I actually really like their design here of having it face down rather than forward, so it's not visible when you're looking at the monitor straight on. There's also one button on the front, the HDR/BI hotkey, which I'll explain a bit more later in the video. The setup is slightly more involved than most monitors. It's two steps instead of just one. First, the foot screws into the stand with a thumb screw, and then the stand screws into the monitor itself, though you'll need a screwdriver for this. The ergonomic adjustments here are pretty limited since it only allows for tilt adjustment. However, big bonus points here because they provide VESA mounts on the back, so you can put it on a third-party monitor arm to get whatever flexibility you need. For connectivity, it has two HDMI 2.0A ports, one DisplayPort version 1.4, and a 3.5mm jack for audio output. It also has two 2-watt speakers, which are decent quality for a monitor, but really nothing to write home about. The audio built into monitors and TVs is almost never good anyway, so this isn't too surprising. It comes with a 1.5 meter or 5-foot HDMI cable and power plugs into a standard 3-prong port, which means no external power brick. Much nicer. The on-screen display is activated by pressing any of the buttons. The left shortcut always leads to the low blue light selection, the middle two can be customized to whichever menu option you want, and the fourth button leads to the full menu. It's not a very attractive interface, but it is very functional and responsive. It works well for what it does. To get the full range of adjustment, you'll need to select the user picture mode. In the user mode, you actually have a lot of room to fine-tune how the monitor looks. It'll let you set brightness, contrast, sharpness, gamma, color temperature, hue, saturation, and AMA, which is just BenQ's name for overdrive. Now onto the panel itself, which is a 60Hz TN with a 1 millisecond response time. It comes with a nice anti-glare coating on the screen, so you don't have to worry about annoying reflections. And even though it's a TN panel, the viewing angles aren't bad, and colors are pretty accurate out of the box. A lot of TN monitors have washed out or desaturated colors, but that's not the case here. However, with a display this large, unless you're sitting pretty far back, you can see some color and contrast shift from the center to the edges. There's really no way around that with a TN. And in terms of black level, it doesn't get super deep, but it's not that bad. The benefit here is that you won't miss any details in the shadows in games. A big screen comes with big-ish power draw, and this one consumes just under 37 watts at full brightness or while running HDR. At minimum brightness, it only consumes 12.5 watts, which is actually surprisingly low. And maybe most impressive is the standby power, which is low enough to read 0.0 watts on my power meter. Nice. For special display features, one of the first I checked out was focus mode. It highlights one area of the screen and dims everything else. Alright, that's actually kind of gimmicky. Anyway, it has a low blue light filter, which isn't available in HDR mode, but it's otherwise really nice for nighttime use. Basically, it just lowers the color temperature of the display to help reduce eye strain at night. I use low blue light filters all the time, so I'm glad to see BenQ included. The next big thing it features is brightness intelligence, or BI. With this on, the monitor uses a light sensor at the base of the panel to adjust the display's brightness based on ambient light. As your room gets darker, it lowers the brightness, and vice versa. I do appreciate that they made it adjust slowly. It takes a few seconds to adjust to ambient light, so you won't get any jarring changes in brightness. You can use the HDR/BI button on the front to quickly toggle HDR and BI on or off, but if HDR is enabled in Windows, the button just toggles BI on or off. Really, I don't think HDR should be a toggleable thing. The monitor should just detect whether or not it's receiving an HDR signal and adjust itself accordingly. Now, looking at HDR in this display, really it's not too impressive. Quick recap if you're out of the loop, HDR stands for High Dynamic Range, which basically just means the game or video has brighter whites and darker blacks than normal content, and has a wider color gamut to allow for more saturated colors. In other words, HDR content on an HDR monitor is supposed to more closely mimic how things look in real life, but HDR is still in its infancy and still pretty finicky. The software support is still far from perfect, and the list of games that actually support HDR is pretty small, something like 40 titles as of late 2018. Because I had played it with HDR before, the first game I wanted to try was Battlefield 1. But I couldn't get HDR to work. That's happened to me on other displays and other computers before, so I wasn't too surprised, and it's not a problem with the display itself. EA DICE just hasn't figured it all out yet. However, Assassin's Creed Odyssey does support HDR, with the one stipulation being I could only get it to work in full screen, not in a borderless window. Comparing HDR versus standard dynamic range on this monitor, it is definitely better, but not mind-blowing. This monitor doesn't really meet accepted specs for actually displaying HDR content. It'd be better to describe this as being able to accept an HDR input rather than display HDR, like several years ago when TVs were described as being 4K ready because they could accept a 4K signal, even though they then displayed it at 1080p. Proper HDR requires much higher contrast, brightness, and color gamut. The VISA organization released standards for HDR performance to give consumers a better idea of what each HDR monitor is actually capable of. Those ratings are HDR 400, HDR 600, and HDR 1000, with HDR 600 being the minimum standard for what most people would consider proper HDR. But a proper HDR 600 4K monitor will cost well over $1,000, several times more than this one. With that in mind, I'd say it's preferable to have a monitor like this that can at least accept an HDR input rather than one that can't at all. As for gaming, this monitor is honestly a pretty good choice if 4K standard dynamic range is your target. It is only 60 Hz, but it has FreeSync with a range of 40 to 60, and to be completely fair, refresh rates above 60 are almost useless on a 4K monitor anyway. Nothing can really drive it except for the very top end of GPUs or by playing at extremely low graphics settings. In terms of performance, I've been using it for several days now, and input lag is definitely somewhere below 10 milliseconds. I can't detect any at all. One big benefit of having a TN panel is that ghosting is almost non-existent. The AMA setting, called overdrive on most other monitors, gives you 3 levels of anti-ghosting to pick from: off, high, and premium. The default setting of high works best and gives very nearly no ghosting. Overall, I'd say really serious gamers would be better served by a smaller, lower resolution, higher refresh rate monitor, but if you use your computer for anything else in addition to gaming, the benefit of having a 28-inch screen and 4K resolution to work with can't be ignored. For a general purpose 4K monitor, the EL2870U is a pretty good choice. It's competitively priced against other 28-inch TN panels and comes with some nice features that many of them don't. Namely, it can accept an HDR input, and its ability to automatically adjust the brightness based on ambient light is a really nice touch. Plus, 4K at this size is very usable for productivity, though you'll want to run Windows high DPI scaling at about 150% for ease of use. On the HDR front, if you're serious about wanting the full HDR experience, you just aren't going to get it for less than 2 to 3 times higher cost. HDR is still new, it's still very expensive, but I think the ability to at least accept HDR content does have value. From the gaming perspective, this is a pretty good choice if you're after 4K with low ghosting and no input lag. The FreeSync range of 40 to 60 is somewhat limited, especially considering that it's likely you'll drop below that frame rate without a pretty high-end PC, but if you can set your graphics settings so it stays in that range, it ends up working out really nicely. Finally, for content creation or other creative work, this is a pretty sweet display. It's not quote-unquote professional, but it also doesn't cost $1,500. The colors look good out of the box, especially for a TN, and 4K at 28 inches is pretty close to ideal in my opinion. That gives you a ton of screen real estate to work with and gives you a super sharp display. The BenQ EL2870U goes for about $450, and if you want to pick one up for yourself, follow the link in the description. Hit subscribe and click the bell icon to get notified of new videos as soon as they're up. So guys, if you like this video, hit the like button. If you want to see more, hit subscribe. And if you have any questions on the EL2870U, leave them in the comments below. Thanks for watching. I hope I helped, and I'll see you in the next video.